Birol, our executive director, and Timur Gul, who is the head of the ETP division here at the IEA. This event is live streamed, and this is the media presentation. For the report, you can find all the findings and the report on our website, and that is iea.org. We will have some time for questions after this from the press. And they can please use the Zoom Q&A box for that. So without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Birol. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure with September that the International Energy Agency is presenting. It is one of the key publications, Energy Technology Perspectives to you and to thousands of people around the world. Starting from today, we will be sharing the results of our report with different countries, different stakeholders, and discuss what these trends, these findings mean for governments, for industry, for citizens. Before going to some of the very exciting and important findings of our Energy Technology Perspectives report, I wanted to put it a bit in context. How does the IEA see the energy and climate challenge in the current context we are in the year 2020, September 2020? Now, this has been, 2020 been a grim year, no question about it. A global pandemic and a major economic crisis. All bad news. But despite this, in one important area, namely clean energy transitions, I see increasing reasons for being optimistic. I wanted to highlight very briefly 4 reasons why we can all be optimistic about clean energy transitions. Number 1, solar. Solar is becoming cheaper and cheaper, and as it stands now, it is the cheapest source of electricity generation in many countries around the world. But this is not the only good news about solar getting cheaper. The second good news about solar is, when we look at the previous years, the bulk of the new solar capacity came from China. The new additions came from China, maybe from US a bit and the others, but now everywhere. From Vietnam to Brazil, from Middle East to Europe. It's becoming a universal move in terms of solar. Also offshore wind, we see huge decline, of course, as IEA 1.5 years ago anticipated big decline in the offshore wind costs. So this is the first reason why I am hopeful and why I am optimistic now, even under these conditions. Second reason for being optimistic, the interest rates. The main hurdle for many clean energy projects is securing the first investment. When we look at the world, the central banks around the world, we see that the massive easing of monetary policy by central banks in response to the economic crisis means wind, solar, electric vehicles should benefit ultra low interest rates for an extended periods. And this can make the life of the clean energy technologies lighter, easier, as they are very low, because for them the issue is the initial investment, because the fuels are basically free. The third reason why I am optimistic, again in this grim year of 2020, and I see that as head of the IEA, talking with many government leaders, energy ministers, and others, I see that many governments around the world are throwing their weight behind clean energy. Advanced economies, emerging countries, and others, and their weight, their motivation ranges from pushing the renewables higher in the power generation mix for air pollution reasons to making legally binding commitments to net zero emissions in 2050. So more governments are throwing their weight behind clean energy. And finally, one more reason why I am optimistic in this year is that I see we work with many energy companies around the world. I can assure you that many, maybe I should say most companies are stepping up their efforts in clean energy. Whether or not this stepping up is strong enough, this is another story, but I see there is a momentum there. It is not only energy companies, but also world's giant technology companies are also stepping up in terms of clean energy. So these are the four reasons I think important to underline as they make me optimistic about clean energy future in this year. But of course, challenges remain, huge challenges. And here, a key issue, a very critical issue, is for the governments, for the investors to make the right technology policies and make the right technology investments. This is extremely critical. And it is the reason we have made a tremendous work. My colleagues, Dr. Gül and his team, some 3 years, we revamped our energy technology perspectives report, and it was my ambition, Timo would remember, to make the ETP world's guidebook for energy technology policy and investments. And when I read the report, I personally believe we reached that objective. My colleagues have analyzed more than 800 technology options one by one, their performance, their maturity, market maturity, cost today, tomorrow, learning curves, everything, and came up with this energy technology perspectives report. Doctor will give you some of the findings, but I want to highlight, for me, it may be different for everybody when you read this excellent report, for me, 3 important takeaways. Number one, when we look at the energy and climate debate around the world, there is an overwhelming concentration of the debate on electricity sector. This is good, but not at all enough to solve our climate problems. Power sector today, in the entire world, is responsible 38% of the emissions. 62% comes from somewhere else. And our ETP, we call it ETP in short way, energy technology perspectives, ETP, tells us that the transforming the power sector alone will only get the world one third of the way to net zero emissions. So the first thing is power sector alone, focusing on power sector alone will not bring us even close to our climate goals. It is important, but not enough. This is number one. Take away for me. Number two, the world's attention, again, another blind spot. Perhaps for me, personally, the most important blind spot in the climate change debate today. What is that? It is the following. The world's attention today is overwhelmingly focused on what we are going to build, the new power plants, new factories, new cars, that they should be clean, sustainable. Yes, they should be. We should focus on them. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a big issue. Namely, we have built power plants, iron steel factories, cement factories, aluminum factories, years and years, and they are with us. There is a huge energy infrastructure, and they will be under normal conditions, unless there is a government intervention or there are other good surprises. They will be with us several decades to come and emitting CO2 emissions. And our colleagues, our ETP colleagues, made an extremely detailed analysis of all power plants in the world. Huge amount of iron steel factories in China, in India, in United States, Europe, elsewhere, looking at their performance, their age, their size, their emission trajectories, and the result is, without addressing the emission issue of the world's existing infrastructure, we will have no chance whatsoever meeting our energy and climate goals. This is an extremely important finding, and International Energy Agency, not only here with the ETP report that we are publishing today, but several months to come, in a stubborn way, going to address this issue. We will soon have the World Energy Outlook coming. Many other reports are coming. This will be a standing issue for the IEA to highlight this issue for the policymakers and everybody to understand. Because one of the tasks of the IEA is being a pedagogical institution to help the people understand the real energy issues. And my colleagues come up with some suggestions, of course, in these areas, from carbon capture and storage to hydrogen and others. And my last point is here, my takeaway. We have the ETP highlights us the CCUS, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen batteries, and they make a list of a wealth of game-changing clean energy technologies that are ready for the big time. And here, in my view, governments will determine their fate. Governments will determine the fate of these technologies, and therefore whether or not we reach our climate goals. So a very important job, task for the governments. So these are the three takeaways for me from this excellent report, but I am looking forward to hear from my colleague, Dr. Timur Gül, the details of this report. Thank you.
Thank you Dr. Birol, and indeed welcome to today's press webinar for the launch of the 2020 edition of the Energy Technology Perspectives. Is the first release of the entire book as such. Since 2017, we had a report on accelerating clean energy innovation that came out in July, which is closely linked to this particular publication, but today is really the first time in 3 years that we are launching a full report. Now, the background to this year's edition of Energy Technology Perspectives is, of course, that there's a growing number of governments and, in fact, companies that are making ambitious pledges to reach net zero emissions. These are very important efforts, of course, but what we try to understand with today's publication with Energy Technology Perspectives 2020 is, what do these net zero emission pledges actually mean in practice? And when I mean in practice, what I mean is in practice for clean energy technologies. As Dr. Birol in his introductory remarks already highlighted, there's of course a lot of reason to be optimistic on clean energy transitions these days. We have seen major uptakes in clean energy technologies, solar PV, on and offshore wind, batteries for the use in electric cars. All this has significantly reduced costs of these critical technologies, which are great news, of course, and give rise to the hope that clean energy transitions in line with the targets that many governments and industries are making are actually possible. But there is also no reason to be complacent. Transitioning the entire energy system to net zero emissions requires much broader technology efforts than what we have achieved so far. In the report and in today's presentation, we identify 3 critical areas. The first one is how to deal with existing assets. Dr. Birol already referred to this. Existing assets, both in power generation and in the industry sector and in all other parts of energy. Number 2 is how to accelerate clean energy innovation. We know, of course, which kind of technologies could be useful to help with the transition of the energy sector to net zero emissions, but it is actually wrong to think that they are all readily available and don't need further innovation. And the third point that we'll make in our report, the third critical area is about clean energy infrastructure, the technologies themselves and the technologies and infrastructures that are required to enable the rapid technology deployment that we will need to reach net zero emissions. Let me go in my presentation now through all these 3 points one by one, and I'll start with the first one, which is about the existing infrastructure. When you look at the energy sector today, emissions from energy come from many different sources. They come from the cars we drive, the planes that we are flying, the trucks that deliver our goods. They come from the way we produce heat for our homes, the electricity for our companies, for our homes. They come from the many different industries that produce vital materials, cement to build our houses and roads, steel to build bridges or cars, plastics to produce the packaging that we need. So there's a lot of emissions coming from all various different parts of the energy sector. The problem with today's emissions is that they can be very long-lived. This is true for many different parts of the energy sector, but it's particularly true for power generation and the industry sector. Coal-fired power plants, this is, I think, a point that we as the IEA have highlighted for many years already. Coal-fired power plants have a lifetime of more than 50 years, but similarly long are the lifetimes in the industry sector. Average lifetime here of different assets is somewhere in between 30 and 40 years, but these assets can be around for much longer. Today's infrastructure will continue to emit if we don't change course in existing assets, and they will emit around 750 gigatons of CO2 for over the next 5 decades. Way too much to reach our ambitious climate goals. And I think one thing that this particular graph here highlights is that it will not be possible for the energy sector to be fully decarbonized by the year 2050, unless we find a way to address emissions from these existing assets. It is, of course, possible to do that. There are many different ways. We can change the way they operate. They can be retired early, or they can be retrofitted with CCUS for them to be able to continue operating as low carbon options. But there is no one single optimal way of dealing with these assets. Much will depend on each country's own circumstances, and the age of the different facilities here is really ultimately a key factor. If you look at power generation, for example, in emerging Asia, 80% of existing coal power capacity was built within the last 20 years. As I said, this is not only a problem of coal-fired power stations, but it's also a problem of assets in heavy industry. When you look at iron and steel production, for example, iron and steel production today constitutes roughly 7% of global energy and process-related CO2 emissions. The plants that generate most of the emissions in this sector, like blast furnaces, DRI furnaces, they have a typical lifetime of around 40 years and can be operated for much longer than that. When you look at the average age of these different facilities today, you see that here in this graph that China is roughly home to more than 50% of global steel production. And our estimate from looking at large parts of the existing facilities is that it has been around 12 years on average since these plants were either constructed or went through a major refurbishment, which basically renders them practically new. Similar situation when you look at the cement sector, which is today responsible for another 7% of energy and process-related CO2 emission. Again, the typical lifetime is around 40 years, but the average age here is much lower. And when you see this graph here, then it jumps right at you. I think that China is home to just over half of global cement production, and the assets are just under 13 years old. The fleet is similarly young in that respect in India. Finally, chemicals production. The chemical industry has a varied amount of different outputs, from ammonia to methanol to high-value chemicals. The sector is today responsible for about 4% of energy and process-related emissions. The majority of the production, as you see here in red and gray, is in Asia and in the Middle East, and many of these plants are still much younger than their typical lifetime. The opportunity in these industries is that these plants come up to a major refurbishment before the end of their typical lifetime, roughly on average every 25 years, which offers a window of opportunity, of course, to change course. If you have the technologies that you need readily available, and the technologies that I'm referring to here are hydrogen, CCUS in particular, then you can refurbish these assets and make them low carbon. Many of the plants are coming up to this investment cycle in the next 10 years. If we miss this window of opportunity and we don't have the technologies readily available, then these plants risk to go through another investment cycle without making use of low carbon technologies. Now, how can we reach our climate goals? When you look at the energy sector, it's important to ask yourself, what are the sectors, what are the technologies to look out for reaching net zero emissions? And the obvious point of departure here is the power sector. As Dr. Birol mentioned, the power sector today contributes almost 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions, has very long lifetimes, the assets that are there involved, but there's also a lot of hope to be optimistic through the advent of renewable energies. There is, of course, no pathway to reach net zero emissions without a major contribution from decarbonizing power. In fact, in our projections, power generation is among the first to be fully decarbonized on the way to net zero emissions. But this in itself is not enough. I think this is very important to recognize. We estimate that in our projections, only 1/3 of the trajectory to net zero emissions comes from decarbonizing power generation. Similar situation for electric cars. Again, there is no pathway to net zero emissions without building on the recent success that we have seen for electric cars, scaling them up further. But in and by itself, this will not be sufficient to reach net zero emissions. The reason is, as I said earlier, the energy sector and its emissions are much broader, are much more varied. They come from airplanes, ships, trucks, buses. They come from these various different industry sectors that I talked about, and they come from the building sector. Without technology solutions for these sectors, and just to remind you, transport, industry, and buildings today make up for 55% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. Without technology opportunities here, we are not going to be able to reach net zero emissions. Now, what will be the technologies that we'll need? There's going to be a whole range of clean energy technologies. In fact, we have don't have the luxury to give up on any of the technologies in the energy system if we want to reach net zero emissions soon. The solutions in particular for end-use sectors will be electricity, they will be about clean hydrogen, they will be about CCUS, and they will be about bioenergy. And we can, of course, discuss which precise fuel mix will be the one in each single subsector by the year we reach net zero emissions. But there's one thing that we cannot negotiate, and that is the importance of accelerating clean energy innovation. In our sustainable development scenario, which is the core of the analysis here, 1/3 of the emission savings required for reaching net zero emissions come from technologies that are today either at large prototype or demonstration level, which means they are not yet commercially available. 1/3 of the emission savings for reaching net zero emissions. We also analyzed what we called a faster innovation case, which reaches net zero emissions already by the year 2050. And what we find here is that almost half of all the emission savings required would need to come from technologies that are not yet commercially available today. And in fact, many of them today are even at small prototype or laboratory stage even. I realize, of course, how this can sound counterintuitive at times. We are used to the success stories for solar PV, for batteries. And if you follow the energy news as I do, then you can see new projects coming in every single day. They're coming from hydrogen-based steelmaking to new carbon capture projects, from electric trucks to hydrogen trucks. But the truth is that these technologies, and in particular, when it comes to heavy industries, and when it comes to long distance transport, they will require a whole lot more innovation. For reaching net zero emissions for the energy sector as a whole, heavy industries and long distance transport, full decarbonization requires technologies or CO2 emission savings from technologies that are currently not yet commercially available today. 3/4 is the share that we find in our analysis. Now, the third and last point that we wanted to make in our presentation today is that net zero emissions will require a major rollout of clean energy technologies and clean energy infrastructure. So what do we mean by that? Think about electricity, for example. In our projections to reach net zero by the year 2050, we will need 2.5 times more electricity generation than what we are producing today. 2.5 times more relative to today by the year 2050. This is to electrify our cars, electrify our trucks, homes, industry. It is partly to produce clean hydrogen and clean hydrogen-based fuels, synthetic fuels. This will require a lot more infrastructure, distribution lines, transmission lines, etc. But it will also require a lot more low carbon power capacity. Last year, we were at just below 200 gigawatts in terms of new capacity installations. The largest solar PV complex today is actually in India at more than 2 gigawatts. But when you're looking at the electricity needs that we would have for reaching net zero emissions through technology by the year 2050, then we will need 4 times as much renewable capacity additions as we achieved in the record year last year, which is and this every year out to 2050. And this is equivalent to adding this largest solar park to the global solar PV installations every 2 days from now to 2050. A similar story for hydrogen. We are currently having, when you look at electrolyzers, for example, a key technology to produce clean hydrogen in a net zero emissions system. We currently have less than 200 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity installed. The largest unit in operation is in Japan currently. It came online earlier this year at around 10 megawatt. This project size is set to grow, of course, significantly. We are seeing a lot of great plans coming online, but the additions that we need out to 2050 for reaching net zero emissions, if they would come from this, from project sizes like the one which is currently the largest, then we need to get one operating every single hour from now to 2050. And finally, CCUS. Progress in CCUS technologies was somewhat behind expectation over the past decade, but it's a technology that we will ultimately need in certain applications such as cement, to produce synthetic fuels, and to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We will in fact release a special report in the context of our Energy Technology Perspective series in a couple of weeks from now, which will look at this in much more depth. The most comprehensive and complex CCS project that is currently underway is in Norway, the Northern Lights project, and the amount of carbon capture that we are adding in order to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050 through technology is equivalent to adding one Northern Lights project every single week from now to 2050. We can, of course, moderate this through changing our consumer behavior, etc., but we will not eliminate the need for significant rollout of clean energy technologies over the next decades to come. Now, let me conclude my presentation by reiterating the statement that Dr. Birol gave at the very beginning of this speech. It's about the decisive role of governments in making this happen. The scale of the challenge that is involved means that governments will be front and center in this endeavor. Markets can do a lot to mobilize capital, catalyze innovation, but ultimately it is governments that are key for reaching net zero emissions. And in our report, we discuss 5 core areas to be addressed. First, it is about tackling emissions from existing assets. We discussed that in the context of our presentation today. Second, it's about strengthening markets for technologies that are currently at early stage of adoption and that still require not only an innovation, but also a policy push in order to rise to the expectation that we are all putting into them. The third is about developing and upgrading infrastructure that enables the technology rollout that we see. It's about boosting support for RD&D. As I said, many technologies are still at pre-commercial situations, and they will benefit from boosting support for RD&D. And finally, it's about expanding international technology collaboration. The scale and of the challenge involved means that this is not a job that anyone can do by him or herself. It benefits from multilateral cooperation in existing fora. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Timur, for your very detailed presentation. So we're going to take some questions now. We'll take a very short break so that we can compile the questions for members of the media. Can you please send your questions through the Q&A chat box in the app? We'll take a 2-minute break and then come back to you right after that. Thank you very much. Okay, we're back. Thank you very much. So we've been getting a number of questions. I'm going to read a few of them, and then we'll take them by three. So the first question from Gulsin Çağatay from Anadolu Agency from Turkey. When do you think hydrogen technologies play significant and mainstream role in the energy sector, like solar energy do today? That's the first question. How can you boost their share of hydrogen in the energy mix? Second question from Tom Pepper from Energy Intelligence. Does the IEA think the strategies announced by Big Oil are even close to delivering the transformation beyond the power sector that the IEA that you just discussed? And then the third question from Konstantin Rosnov from Argus. Which technologies should oil and gas companies focus on investing in to reduce emissions in the oil and gas operations? Are oil and gas companies spending enough on clean energy, on clean technologies? Perhaps, Timur, the hydrogen question could go to you and Dr. Birol, the other two.
Yeah, thank you, Jed. A very good question. I think for hydrogen, it's important to recognize, of course, that hydrogen is not one single technology, but there are many, many different technologies involved for the production of clean hydrogen, to the way we deliver hydrogen, towards the use of hydrogen in various different sectors. If I would single out a technology here, I think it's really about electrolyzers that are somewhat ready for the big time now, as you would say. It's a technology that has been around for a long time. Electrolyzer as such are not a new technology, but the cost reductions that we have seen, the technology improvements that we have seen, have actually led to a project pipeline that is around 2.8 gigawatt now. If they all come online, then the amount of electrolyzers that we'll see in 3 years from now will jump from less than 200 megawatt to 3 gigawatts within 3 years of time. So excellent progress here. What we have to watch out for is what is going to be the market for this new clean energy, clean hydrogen that we will be producing. And there are many different things governments can do. Again, if I had to pick one, I would support blending into natural gas grids, which is a very reliable way to stimulate clean hydrogen demand moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to go back to the other two questions from Tom Pepper from Energy Intelligence on big oil announcements, and from Konstantin Rosnov on oil and gas investments. Dr. Birol.
Right, thank you very much. So we are seeing several oil and gas companies, mainly the international oil companies, are reshaping their business strategies and putting more and more emphasis on the clean energy technologies. Whether or not they do it because of the pressure from the investors or citizens, or they want to be a part of the solution, and at the same time prepare their business strategy for a different world, is an open question. But I see many international oil companies are moving in that direction. They are focusing on, of course, a lot of them on solar, and several of them are offshore wind, because offshore wind and offshore oil and gas practices have many things in common. They can learn from each other. And some of them are pushing the carbon capture and storage and hydrogen technologies. So different options there. We need them. If we want to be successful in addressing the climate change, the world needs big energy companies to be active and address this climate change issue, because they have deep pockets, they have an expertise in managing huge projects, and they are technology leaders in many aspects. So them being a part of the solution is critically important. Having said that, giving you a number, there is a overwhelming, again, concentration of the attention on the publicly listed companies, oil companies. And we are seeing in Europe, some of them in North America and so on. But ladies and gentlemen, these companies, their own emissions are making less than 10% of all the emissions. There is a huge number of not publicly listed companies who are not, at least at this stage, in the center of the debate today, and there is not enough policy attention in my view. But we need all the energy companies to push the clean energy transition. In my view, no company will be unaffected from clean energy transitions.
Many thanks, Dr. Birol. So we have another set of 3 questions. The first one from Rumiana Bakarelska from S&P Global. What are the technologies in nuclear power generation that will push existing assets and bring new technologies to end PPSs? The second one from Robert Hodgson from ENDS Europe. Would it be fair to say that you see CCS, CCUS, and clean hydrogen by far as the most significant technologies to achieve net zero? And the third one from Junior Isles from MIB Media, similar questions on CCS. Despite being discussed for many years now, CCS continues to face cost challenges. Thank you.
So we have in our report, we have highlighted that in the absence of several new clean energy technologies being a part of the mainstream package of solutions, we have no chance whatsoever to reach our climate goals. Solar is growing, very good news. As I said, becoming the cheapest source of electricity generation in many parts of the world. Very good news. Wind is growing, but this is not enough. This is not enough. We need other technologies, and our energy technology perspectives report looked at 800 different policy technology options, 800 different technology options, and hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, batteries, bioenergy appears to be front runners today. Now I understand that the carbon capture and storage was with us a long time, and we have not seen a major breakthrough yet. Yes, but at the same time, we have said several times that the existing infrastructure, especially the existing infrastructure in the coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants, the industry sector need carbon capture and storage. And I am seeing a growing momentum also in the carbon capture and storage, ranging from North America, US, Canada, several European countries, in Asia, and elsewhere. So it is up to governments whether or not they want the carbon capture and storage to be part of the solution. In my view, we don't have many options to have a bridge between our huge fossil fuel assets and our climate goals. Carbon capture can solve it. Tweets cannot. So we need technologies to address this issue, and having a marriage between the fossil fuel assets we have and the emissions reduction targets we have. I can tell you that the question whether or not CCS will extend the lifetime of fossil fuels, I really don't mind. For me, the issue is very clear. Energy is good. Emissions are bad. Energy is a good thing. But emissions is a bad thing. If we can have the energy without emissions, where is the problem? Of course, today we have readily available emission-free technologies such as solar and wind. We will make the most out of it, but this is not enough. We need to make use of other technologies, as our energy technology perspectives report show. The nuclear question, we are an organization which looks all the fuels, all the technologies, and nuclear power is today the second largest carbon-free electricity generation source. And in many parts of the world, it is difficult to build new nuclear power plants for the public opposition reasons, which we do respect and understand. And in some countries, it is because of they require huge down payment nuclear power plants because of those reasons. But we also see that some countries still built large-sized nuclear power plants, such as China, very recently had final investment decisions for 2 new nuclear power plants. But we are seeing that more and more countries are interested in the small modular reactors around the world, which can find a solution to the problem of the huge capital investments needed at the first stage. And if they are commercialized, it can be, again, one technology the countries may want to look into. Thank you.
So on the bioenergy question about whether it's somewhat the elephant in the room here, I think for bioenergy, what we need to be just generally aware of is that it's extremely versatile. You can use it practically everywhere again. You can use it in the transport sector as a biofuel. You can use it in the industry sector for a variety of different purposes. You can produce biomethane, so a type of biomass-based gas. And you can use it with CCS to produce negative emissions. So there are many, many different applications for bioenergy. The trouble with bioenergy is less its versatility. It's in fact, when you look at transport, it's a drop-in fuel. You can use it in existing infrastructure, which is a great advantage over other technology options. But the problem is its sustainability. We have in our analysis constraint the amount of sustainable bioenergy to contribute to net zero emissions on the grounds of sustainability concerns, of course. It will require the development of many different resources. Despite those constraints, it's very ambitious numbers, in fact. It will require residues from waste, from agriculture, from forestry. Otherwise, it is very difficult for bioenergy to make its contribution. But it's absolutely a technology that we are, or a fuel, if for that matter, that we are following here very closely here at the IEA through our BioFuture platform and various other activities.
Thank you very much, Timur. So we have still quite a few questions, many questions, but in the interest of time, we might just take 2 last ones, if you agree, Dr. Birol. First one from James Varley from NS Media Group. 50 years was mentioned as a typical lifetime for coal plants, but we're now seeing many being closed down ahead of time or converted. Have you made any allowance for that in your projections? That's probably something for you, Timur. And the last questions we'll take today from Delia Metcone from the Economist Intelligence Unit. What are the most effective government policies to accelerate clean tech, including or perhaps carbon price market mechanisms, mandates, or funding first of kind projects, or all of those together? Perhaps this could be a good concluding question for you, Dr. Birol. Timur?
Yeah, thank you, Jet. I think we can be reasonably quick on this one. Of course, we are taking this into account. We are taking into account the competition of that coal-fired power plants have with other technologies, with renewables, etc. But this is already happening under baseline conditions. What we are making allowance for in our projections when it comes to a low carbon pathway to achieve net zero emissions are basically 3 things. It is for coal-fired power plants, it's changing operations. It is retrofitting with CCUS, and it's early retirement of the facilities. Depending on the economics and the wider context of the power sector in each country that we are modeling individually.
So we have seen how effective the government policies can be in the context of solar, wind, and we are seeing also now in offshore wind. The onshore wind we have already seen, offshore wind we are now witnessing how the prices, the cost of the offshore wind is going down. So very good news. So there is no reason that the governments cannot repeat these success stories. I have mentioned that our report highlights several technologies, but if I have to pick up 3 of them, hydrogen, the electrolyzers cost need to come down, CCUS, and the batteries. In my view, they are all ready for the big time. And what is needed, this can be anything, this can be from the tax credits to, in some cases, in other cases, it can be direct the mandates, regulatory measures, in some cases, subsidies. Different countries, different governments can choose different roles. But what is not different, what is applies to everybody, is that in the absence of government interventions, we cannot see these technologies to mature enough as quickly as we would like to see. This is clear. And it is the reason I said the governments around the world will determine the fate of these clean energy technologies, and therefore whether we reach our climate goals or not. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Birol. Many thanks, Timur. This concludes our presentation for ETP 2020. The report is available for free on our website. And just a couple of scheduling notes. We will have a special report on CCUS coming out towards the end of the month, and the World Energy Outlook on October 13. So thank you very much for your attention. We'll see you